The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, moving faster than any rider had a right to in the unforgiving terrain of Montana's Copper Ridge Valley. What emerged from that swirling cloud would challenge everything the local ranching community believed about strength, skill, and who belonged in the saddle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackstone Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of some of the most challenging terrain in Copper Ridge Valley. Its owner, Marcus Blackstone, had built his reputation on two things: breeding the finest quarter horses in Montana and maintaining the most demanding standards for his ranch hands. At 62, his weathered face bore the lines of 4 decades spent under the relentless sun, and his steel-gray eyes held the unwavering conviction of a man who believed he knew exactly how the world should work. That particular morning in Quonwing, late September, Marcus stood on his porch watching his foreman, Jake Sullivan, struggle to manage the chaos unfolding in the main corral. 3 of his best cowboys had quit the previous week, citing better opportunities at the Henderson spread 2 valleys over. The truth was simpler and more concerning. Word had gotten out about Marcus's harsh treatment of his workers, his impossible expectations, and his complete unwillingness to adapt to changing times. The remaining hands were overwhelmed. Cattle needed to be moved to winter pastures before the first serious snow. Fences required mending after the summer storms, and the annual horse roundup was already 3 weeks behind schedule. Jake approached the porch, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Boss, we got a problem. Tommy Rodriguez threw his back out trying to break that wild stallion yesterday, and Doc says he'll be laid up for at least a month. That leaves us 4 men short for the roundup, and we're already pushing it with the weather forecast." Marcus spat into the dirt beside the porch steps. "Then work the men we have harder. Pay them overtime if you need to. But I'm not lowering my standards just because times are tough. Sir, with respect, we've already got ads running in every paper from here to Billings. The problem isn't finding people willing to work. It's finding people willing to work for you." Jake immediately regretted his words, but the truth had been weighing on him for months. Marcus's jaw tightened. "My father built this ranch with standards, Sullivan. We hire the best, we pay the best, and we demand the best. That means experienced cowboys who can handle anything this land throws at them. Not some weekend riders looking for an adventure, and certainly not." He was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A battered pickup truck, its red paint faded to rust in places, pulled into the ranch's main drive. The engine knocked slightly before falling silent, and the driver's door creaked open. What stepped out defied every expectation Marcus had formed in his 62 years of ranching life. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid that fell past her shoulders. She wore faded jeans that had clearly seen real work, not fashion, and boots that were scuffed from genuine use. Her flannel shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms marked with the kind of calluses that came from years of rope work and hard labor. But it was her eyes that caught Marcus's attention, deep green, direct, and completely unintimidated by the imposing ranch owner studying her from his porch. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, crossing the dusty yard with long, purposeful strides. "Morning," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the space between them. "I'm here about the job posting. Saw it in the Missoula paper." Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar irritation. This happened at least once a month. Some city woman who thought ranch work was romantic, usually after watching too many movies or reading too many novels. They never lasted more than a day, and he'd grown tired of wasting his time explaining why ranching wasn't suitable work for women. "Miss," he began, his tone already dismissive, "I appreciate your interest, but this isn't the kind of work you're looking for. We're running a working cattle ranch here, not a dude ranch experience. The job requires— Let me guess, she interrupted, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Early mornings, late nights, heavy lifting, difficult animals, harsh weather, and the ability to ride hard terrain for hours at a time without complaint. Marcus blinked, momentarily thrown off by her directness. Well, yes, but perfect. That's exactly the kind of work I'm looking for. She extended her hand toward him. Elena Vasquez. I've been working ranches since I was 12 years old. And I can promise you, I've never backed down from a challenge. Jake Sullivan watched this exchange with growing interest. In all his years working for Marcus Blackstone, he'd never seen anyone interrupt the man twice in one conversation and walk away unscathed. Yet there was something about this woman's demeanor that suggested she wasn't being disrespectful. Just efficient. Marcus ignored the extended hand. Miss Vasquez, I'm sure you're a fine person, but this ranch has certain standards. We need experienced cowboys who can handle our specific challenges. The work is dangerous. The hours are long, and frankly, I don't hire women for ranch work. It's nothing personal, it's just practical. Elena let her hand drop, but her expression didn't change. If anything, her smile widened slightly. What specific challenges are you dealing with right now that make you think I couldn't handle them? It's not about any specific, because from what I can see, she continued, glancing around the ranch with the practiced eye of someone who knew what to look for. You've got cattle that need moving, horses that need breaking, and fences that need mending. Your remaining hands look exhausted, which tells me you're short-staffed and running behind schedule. Am I wrong? Jake coughed slightly, trying to hide what might have been amusement. Marcus shot him a warning look before turning back to Elena. Miss Vasquez, even if you had the experience, which I doubt, this isn't about what needs doing. It's about having the physical strength and endurance to do it properly. We're talking about controlling 1,500-pound bulls, riding in conditions that would challenge any experienced cowboy, and working 18-hour days when necessary. Elena nodded thoughtfully. You're right that those are real challenges. Mind if I ask what your biggest concern is right now? What's keeping you up at night worrying about this ranch? The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd been prepared for arguments, protests, maybe tears. He hadn't expected strategic thinking. Despite himself, he found his answer coming honestly. We've got 300 head of cattle that need to be moved to winter pastures in the high country. The route goes through some of the most challenging terrain in the state, narrow canyon passes, steep switchbacks, river crossings. One mistake could mean losing cattle, or worse, losing a rider. And we've got maybe 2 weeks before the weather turns and makes the whole thing impossible. How many experienced riders do you have for that job? 4, counting Jake here. Maybe 5 if Tommy's back recovers faster than expected. Elena was quiet for a moment, studying the distant mountains that formed the boundary of Marcus's property. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from conversational to professional. I've moved cattle through terrain like that before. 3 summers ago, I helped drive 800 head through the Bertooth Mountains when a late spring snowstorm forced us to take an alternate route. Last year, I spent 6 months working the Macleod Ranch in Wyoming, where the standard practice was moving herds through the country that would make your canyon passes look like a Sunday ride. Marcus felt his irritation flare again. Every drifter who showed up at his ranch had stories. Tales of other jobs, other ranches, other challenges they claimed to have conquered. The difference was that most of them were at least male, which meant they had some theoretical possibility of backing up their claims. Miss Vasquez, I'm sure you have many interesting stories, but I'm not telling you stories, Mr. Blackstone. I'm giving you references. Call Jim McLeod in Sheridan. Ask him about Elena Vasquez, who worked his spring and summer drives. Or talk to Maria Santos at the Double Eagle Ranch in Colorado. She'll tell you about the winter I spent helping her break horses that 3 different professional trainers had given up on. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting a folded piece of paper. Here are their numbers, along with contact information for 5 other ranchers I've worked for over the past 8 years. Every one of them will tell you the same thing. I work harder, ride better, and cause less trouble than most of the men they've hired. Marcus stared at the paper without taking it. The logical part of his mind recognized that anyone confident enough to offer references probably had reason to be confident. But 40 years of assumptions weren't easily overturned by one conversation with a stranger. Even if everything you're saying is true, he said slowly, there are other considerations. Ranch work isn't just about individual skill, it's about how the crew works together. The men I employ have worked together for years. They depend on each other in dangerous situations. Introducing a woman into that dynamic changes everything. How? The simple question hung in the air. Marcus found himself struggling to articulate what had always seemed obvious to him. Well, there are distractions, different social dynamics, complications that don't exist when you have a team of experienced men who understand each other. Alina nodded as if this made perfect sense. So your concern is that your current crew is so unprofessional that they can't focus on their work when there's a woman around? That's not what I said, but it is what you implied. You're suggesting that the presence of a female coworker would create problems for your existing team. That either means your current employees are easily distracted from dangerous work, or it means you're assuming I would create drama where none existed before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake Sullivan found himself genuinely impressed despite his attempts to remain neutral. In his 15 years working for Marcus Blackstone, he'd seen dozens of potential hires try to argue their way into a job. Most relied on desperation or bravado. This woman was using logic, and she was winning. Marcus felt the conversation slipping away from him, moving into territory where his usual arguments seemed less solid than they had in the past. Miss Vasquez, the bottom line is that I've built this ranch on proven methods and reliable practices. I hire experienced cowboys because that system works. I'm not interested in social experiments or proving points about gender equality. I need reliable workers who can do the job without creating complications. Fair enough. What would it take to prove to you that I'm a reliable worker who won't create complications? The question was reasonable, which somehow made it more irritating. Marcus glanced at Jake, who was clearly following the conversation with interest, then back at Elena. It would take years of proven experience working this specific kind of terrain with these specific challenges. Which brings us back to where we started. I don't hire women for ranch work. Elena was quiet for several seconds, her gaze moving from Marcus to Jake to the mountains beyond the ranch buildings. When she spoke again, her tone had changed subtly. The professional courtesy was still there, but underneath, it was something harder. Mr. Blackstone, I respect that this is your ranch and your decision. But I think you're making a mistake that's going to cost you more than just the opportunity to hire a good worker. And what mistake is that? You're confusing tradition with wisdom. Just because something has always been done a certain way, doesn't mean it's the best way, or even a good way. Your current approach to hiring has left you short-handed at the worst possible time of year, with critical work going undone because you'd rather operate with insufficient staff than consider the possibility that your assumptions might be wrong. Marcus felt his temper beginning to rise. Miss Vasquez, I've been running this ranch successfully for 40 years. I think I know a little more about what works here than someone who showed up 20 minutes ago, with a handful of references and a lot of opinions. You're absolutely right. You know this ranch, this land, and this work better than I do. But I know something you don't know. I know what I'm capable of. And I know that right now, you need capable people more than you need to prove a point about who belongs in a saddle. She folded the paper with the reference numbers and tucked it back into her wallet. I'm going to be in town for 3 days, staying at the Copper Ridge Motel. If you change your mind about giving me a chance to prove what I can do, you know where to find me. Elena turned and walked back toward her truck with the same confident stride she'd used approaching the ranch house. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine despite its protesting knock, and drove away without looking back. Marcus and Jake stood in silence, watching the dust cloud kicked up by her departure slowly settle in the still morning air. The storm hit Copper Ridge Valley that evening with a vengeance that reminded everyone why Montana winters were legendary. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the ranch buildings in stark momentary detail. Each flash revealed the growing chaos in his operation. Loose equipment scattered by the wind, horses restless in the paddocks, and cattle bunching together nervously. In the lower pastures, his phone rang 3 times during dinner. The first call was from his neighbor, Tom Henderson, whose voice carried bad news across the crackling connection. Marcus, I hate to do this to you, but I'm pulling my offer to loan you those 2 riders for your cattle drive. My own crew just discovered we've got a sick bull contaminating one of our herds, and I need every man I can get to sort this mess out. The second call came from Dr. Patricia Wells, the local veterinarian. Tommy Rodriguez's back injury is worse than we initially thought. He's going to need surgery, which means he'll be out for at least 3 months, probably closer to 6. I'm sorry, Marcus. The third call was the one that made his stomach drop. Jake Sullivan's voice was tight with worry. Boss, we just lost another man. Danny Morrison got word that his father had a heart attack down in Texas. He's leaving tomorrow morning. Says he doesn't know when he'll be back. Marcus hung up the phone and stared out at the storm, feeling the weight of 40 years of ranching experience pressing down on him. He'd weathered droughts, floods, market crashes, and disease outbreaks. He'd survived the death of his wife 15 years ago, and the gradual departure of his children to lives in distant cities. But he'd never faced the possibility that his own stubbornness might be the thing that finally broke his ranch. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that promised winter was coming whether he was ready or not. Marcus walked his property lines, surveying damage from the storm and trying to calculate how much work his reduced crew could realistically accomplish before the weather turned completely. He found Jake near the horse barn, struggling to repair a section of fencing that had been damaged when a falling branch spooked the horses into a panic. The older man was working alone, moving slowly and favoring his left shoulder, an old injury that always acted up when the barometric pressure dropped. Where's everyone else? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Bill's out, checking the cattle after last night's excitement. Found about 30 heads that broke through the fence line and scattered into the timber. Could take him most of the day to round them up alone. Jake straightened with obvious effort. Mike's up at the north pasture trying to repair the water system. That lightning strike yesterday fried the pump controls, and without water up there, we'll have to move those cattle whether we're ready or not. Marcus did quick mental math. 2 men, spread across thousands of acres, trying to handle work that normally required twice their number. And winter weather is approaching faster than any of them wanted to acknowledge. What about temporary help? Day laborers from town? Jake shook his head. Already tried. Word's gotten around about our situation, and nobody wants to sign up for what they're calling Blackstone's impossible standards. Plus, most of the experienced hands in the area are already committed to other outfits for the season. They worked in silence for several minutes, Marcus holding fence posts while Jake secured wire. Both men were lost in their own thoughts, calculating odds and timelines that seemed increasingly unfavorable. It was Jake who finally spoke what they were both thinking. Boss, about that woman yesterday. She's not qualified for this kind of work, Sullivan. I don't care what references she claims to have. How do you know? The question was asked quietly, without challenge, but it stopped Marcus in his tracks. He realized he'd been so focused on his assumptions about women in general that he hadn't actually considered Elena Vasquez as an individual candidate. "Jake, I've been ranching for 40 years. I know what this work requires. I'm not questioning your experience, sir. I'm asking how you know she's not qualified when you never gave her a chance to demonstrate what she can do." Marcus felt irritation. Flair, but underneath it was something else, a nagging doubt that had been growing since yesterday's encounter. Because ranching isn't about what someone claims they can do. It's about what they prove they can do under pressure, in dangerous conditions, when everything goes wrong at once. Exactly. So why not let her prove it? Before Marcus could answer, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Both men looked up to see a familiar red pickup truck turning into the ranch drive, moving fast enough to kick up a trail of dust despite the previous night's rain. Elena Vasquez climbed out of the truck looking like she'd been awake for hours. Her hair was still in yesterday's practical braid, but now she wore a heavy canvas jacket and leather work gloves. More significantly, she wasn't alone. Two men emerged from the passenger side of the truck. The first was clearly a ranch hand. Lean, weathered, with the easy movement of someone who spent his life in the saddle. The second was older, distinguished, wearing clothes that suggested management rather than manual labor. Elena approached with the same confident stride Marcus remembered from their previous encounter, but now her expression was more serious. Focused. "Mr. Blackstone, I'd like you to meet Jim McLeod." The older man extended his hand with a firm grip and direct eye contact. "Mr. Blackstone, Elena asked me to drive down from Wyoming to have a word with you. I don't usually make personal recommendations for my former employees, but in her case, I'm making an exception." Marcus found himself shaking hands despite his confusion. "Mr. McLeod, I'm not sure what Elena told you, but she told me you've got cattle that need moving and not enough experienced riders to do it safely. She also told me you don't believe a woman can handle the job." McLeod's tone was matter-of-fact, without judgment, but his words carried the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "I drove 8 hours to tell you personally that you're wrong." The younger man stepped forward. "Tommy Martinez, Mr. Blackstone. I worked with Elena at the McLeod Ranch for 2 seasons. She saved my life during a river crossing when my horse went down in high water. Never seen anyone handle a rope or read terrain better than she does." Marcus felt the conversation spinning away from him again. "Gentlemen, I appreciate you coming all this way, but this is a business decision based on practical considerations. I need experienced cowboys who can." "Elena is an experienced cowboy," McLeod interrupted. "Better than most men I've hired over 30 years of ranching. The difference is that she's also smart enough to think before she acts and practical enough to solve problems instead of just complaining about them." "That's all very interesting, but let her prove it," Elena said, cutting through the debate. "Give me one job. One task that you consider a real test of what this work requires. If I can't handle it, I'll leave and you'll never see me again. But if I can, then we can talk about the terms of employment." Marcus looked from Elena to McLeod to Martinez, then over to Jake, who was watching the entire exchange with obvious fascination. "Miss Vasquez, even if I wanted to consider such a test, what makes you think I have time for games? We're already behind schedule on critical work." "Because I brought help," she said simply. "Jim and Tommy drove down specifically to assist with whatever needs doing while you evaluate my capabilities. You get extra hands for your immediate problems, and I get a chance to demonstrate what I can do. Everyone benefits." McLeod nodded. "Elena explained your situation. I've got 3 days before I need to be back in Wyoming, and Tommy here is between jobs until next month. We're offering free labor in exchange for giving her a fair evaluation." Marcus stared at the three of them, trying to process what was happening. In 40 years of ranching, no potential employee had ever shown up with character references, experienced backup help, and a detailed plan for addressing his immediate needs. The gesture was so unprecedented that he found himself temporarily speechless. Jake Sullivan stepped into the silence. "Boss, what have we got to lose? We need help, and they're offering it for free. Even if the test doesn't work out the way she hopes, we still come out ahead. What kind of test did you have in mind?" Marcus heard himself asking, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Elena glanced toward the mountains, visible in the distance, beyond the ranch buildings. "You mentioned moving cattle through canyon passes and river crossings. I saw about 30 heads scattered in the timber when I drove in this morning. Probably the ones that broke loose during last night's storm. Give me the job of bringing them back safely, through whatever terrain they've chosen to hide in, and I'll do it alone while Jim and Tommy help you with your other immediate problems." "Alone?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Miss Vasquez, those cattle could be anywhere in 5,000 acres of rough country. Some of those areas are dangerous even for experienced riders who know the terrain. I can't have you getting lost or injured on my property. Then send someone with me who knows the terrain. Let them observe how I work, how I handle the challenges, whether I can bring the cattle back safely. At the end of the day, you'll have your scattered herd back where they belong, and you'll have seen exactly what I'm capable of." Jake cleared his throat. "I could ride with her, boss. I know every trail and water source in that timber. If she's as capable as she claims, we'll have those cattle back by evening. If she's not, he shrugged. Well, at least I'll be there to prevent any disasters." Marcus looked around at the faces watching him expectantly. McLeod and Martinez clearly believed Elena could succeed. Jake seemed genuinely curious to see what would happen. Even Elena herself appeared calm, confident, as if the outcome was already decided in her mind. The rational part of his brain recognized this as a reasonable proposal. He needed those cattle rounded up anyway, and having extra help with his other problems was undeniably valuable. But accepting the test meant acknowledging that his assumptions might be wrong, and that was harder to do than he wanted to admit. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "what happens when you fail? When you realize that reading about ranch work in books or handling gentled horses on easier terrain isn't the same as dealing with wild cattle in dangerous country?" Elena's smile returned, but now it carried an edge of something that might have been anticipation. "Mr. Blackstone, I've never failed a job I said I could do. But if I do fail this one, then you'll have learned something important about me, and I'll have learned something important about myself. Either way, we'll both know where we stand." Marcus found himself nodding before he'd fully decided to agree. "Fine, one test. You bring back those scattered cattle safely, without help except for Jake's guidance on terrain, and we'll discuss employment terms. But if anything goes wrong, if you get hurt, if cattle are lost, if you prove unable to handle the work, then this conversation ends permanently. Understood? And you," he turned to McLeod and Martinez, "are willing to spend 3 days helping with ranch work just to give her this opportunity?" McLeod's weathered face cracked into the first smile Marcus had seen from him. "Mr. Blackstone, Elena Vasquez is one of the finest hands I've ever had the privilege to work with. But more than that, she's someone who changes how people think about what's possible. If giving her this chance means 3 days of free labor, then it's 3 days well spent." Marcus looked up at the clear morning sky, then toward the timber where his missing cattle had taken refuge. Somewhere in that rough country, 30 head of valuable livestock were scattered and stressed, vulnerable to predators and weather. Getting them back safely would require skill, patience, and the kind of intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that couldn't be taught from books. "All right, Miss Vasquez, saddle up. Let's see what you can do." The horses Marcus brought out were not the gentle trail mounts he might have offered to a casual rider. Instead, he led 2 of his working quarter horses from the barn, seasoned animals with the intelligence and stamina required for serious cattle work, but also the temperament to challenge any rider who wasn't completely confident in the saddle. Jake's Mount was a steady bay gelding named Ranger, a 12-year-old horse who knew the mountain terrain like a hound knows a familiar trail. For Elena, Marcus selected a different challenge entirely, a 6-year-old buckskin mare called Storm, beautiful but notoriously difficult, with a reputation for testing every rider who attempted to work with her. Storm here has been through 3 different cowboys this season, Marcus said, watching Elena approach the mare with interest. She's got more natural cattle sense than any horse I've ever owned, but she doesn't take orders from riders she doesn't respect. Most men can't even get her to take the bite properly. Elena studied the mare for several seconds, taking in her alert ears, the way she shifted her weight when approached, the intelligent wariness in her dark eyes. Instead of immediately reaching for the bridle, Elena simply stood beside Storm, letting the horse grow accustomed to her presence. "She's testing me before I even try to ride her," Elena said, more to herself than to the men watching. "Smart girl. She knows that working cattle in rough terrain means trusting your rider completely, and she's not about to give that trust to someone who hasn't earned it." What happened next surprised even Jake, who'd been around horses his entire life. Instead of forcing the issue with authority and strength, the approach most cowboys used with difficult horses, Elena began talking to Storm in a low, steady voice. Not baby talk or meaningless chatter, but a running commentary about what she was planning to do, where they would be going, and what she expected from their partnership. The mare's ears swiveled forward, listening. When Elena finally reached for the bridle, Storm lowered her head cooperatively, accepting the bit without the resistance that had frustrated so many previous riders. Marcus felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, something that might have been doubt about his own certainty. "Well," he said gruffly, "getting her to accept the bridle is one thing. Let's see how she feels about actually being ridden." Elena swung into the saddle with an easy motion that spoke of years of practice. Storm shifted beneath her, testing the rider's balance and confidence, with small movements that could easily escalate into real rebellion if the horse sensed any uncertainty. But Elena's seat remained relaxed and secure, her hands light on the reins, her entire posture communicating calm competence. After a moment of evaluation, Storm seemed to reach a decision. The tension left her frame, and she stood quietly, waiting for direction from her rider. Jake mounted Ranger and shook his head in amazement. "Boss, in 15 years working with that mare, I've never seen her settle for a new rider that quickly. Usually it takes weeks of fighting before she decides to cooperate." Marcus climbed into his own pickup truck, planning to follow the riders and observe Elena's performance from a distance. But as they headed toward the timber where the cattle had scattered, he found himself genuinely curious about what was about to unfold. The terrain they entered was exactly the kind of country that separated experienced hands from weekend riders. Ancient game trails wound through dense stands of pine and aspen, climbing steadily toward ridgelines that offered spectacular views but treacherous footing. Rock outcroppings created natural barriers that required careful navigation, and small streams crossed the paths at irregular intervals, sometimes running clear and shallow, sometimes deep enough to challenge both horse and rider. Jake led them to the area where the scattered cattle had last been seen, then pulled up his horse to let Elena take the lead. "From here on, it's your show," he said. "The tracks head up toward Devil's Canyon, but there are at least 4 different routes they could have taken, depending on how spooked they were." Elena studied the ground carefully, reading the story written in hoofprints, disturbed vegetation, and scattered cattle droppings. After several minutes, she pointed toward a narrow trail that climbed steeply through a stand of lodgepole pines. They went up there first, probably running from the storm. But see how the tracks change about 50 yards up. They slow down, start browsing. The panic wore off and they began looking for shelter and food. My guess is they're holed up in one of the meadows higher up, probably near water. Jake nodded approvingly. "That's good reading. But there are 3 different meadows up there, and two of them are separated by some pretty challenging country. How do you want to approach it?" Instead of answering immediately, Elena closed her eyes and sat perfectly still in her saddle for merely a minute. To Marcus, watching from his truck below, she appeared to be listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. "Southeast," she said finally, opening her eyes and pointing toward a barely visible gap between two rocky outcroppings. "The wind's been coming from the northwest since the storm passed. Cattle always try to get downwind from the weather when they're looking for shelter. Plus, I can hear water running in that direction, probably the spring-fed creek that runs through the high meadow." She turned Storm toward the indicated route and began climbing, moving with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural. Mari responded to her rider's certainty, picking her way carefully but steadily up terrain that would have challenged many experienced horses. Jake followed, but Marcus could see that even the veteran foreman was impressed by Elena's route selection. The path she'd chosen was definitely more difficult than the obvious alternatives, but it was also more direct, and it avoided several areas where loose rock or steep drops could create serious hazards. As they climbed higher, the forest began to thin, giving way to open parks and meadows surrounded by stands of aspen whose leaves had turned brilliant gold in the autumn weather. It was a beautiful country, but also deceptive, the kind of terrain where a single mistake could result in serious injury to both horse and rider. Marcus found himself holding his breath as he watched Elena navigate a particularly challenging section where the trail skirted the edge of a steep ravine. Storm moved carefully but without hesitation, trusting her rider's judgment completely. Behind them, Jake and Ranger followed the same path with equal care, but noticeably more tension. The sound reached them before they saw the cattle, the low, contented lowing of animals that had found food and water, and were no longer stressed by the previous night's storm. Elena held up her hand, signaling for silence, then dismounted and moved forward on foot to survey the situation. What she saw confirmed her instincts. Nearly 30 head of cattle were scattered across a natural meadow, grazing peacefully beside a clear creek that wound through the center of the clearing. They were calm now, but Marcus knew from experience that moving them would require exceptional skill. Cattle that had been spooked once were likely to spook again, and in this terrain, a stampede could be disastrous. Elena returned to where Jake waited and spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the cattle. "They're settled, but they're still nervous. See how they're bunched toward the far end of the meadow? They've got their backs to the only easy exit route, which means they're still thinking defensively. So how do you want to work with them? Patience first. We let them see us, let them get used to our presence, before we try to move them. Then we work them slowly, using the natural contours of the meadow to guide them toward the trail instead of forcing them." What followed was a masterclass in cattle psychology and horsemanship. Elena positioned herself and Storm at the edge of the meadow, clearly visible to the cattle but not threatening. She sat motionless for nearly 20 minutes, allowing the animals to observe her and decide she wasn't a danger. Gradually, some of the cattle began moving in her direction, curious about the newcomers. When she finally began to move, it was with deliberate slowness, using Storm's natural presence and her own understanding of cattle behavior to guide the herd's movement rather than forcing it. Jake positioned himself on the opposite side of the meadow, ready to prevent any cattle from breaking away from the group, but Elena's approach made his assistance largely unnecessary. The cattle moved as a cohesive unit, following the natural flow of the terrain toward the trail that would lead them home. The descent was where real skill mattered most. Moving 30 heads of cattle down steep, narrow trails required perfect timing, constant awareness of each animal's position and mood, and the ability to anticipate and prevent problems before they developed into disasters. Elena demonstrated all of these qualities and more. When a young bull began showing signs of rebellion, she positioned Storm to block his escape route without confrontation. When several cows became nervous about a narrow section of trail, She dismounted and led them through on foot, showing them the path was safe. When the herd bunched up at a creek crossing, she used a combination of vocal commands and strategic positioning to keep them moving without panic. Marcus found himself following the entire operation with growing amazement. He'd seen experienced cowboys struggle with smaller herds in easier terrain. Yet Alina was handling this challenging drive with an ease that made it look almost effortless. But the real test came when they encountered an unexpected obstacle. Recent rockslide had partially blocked one of the main trail junctions, forcing the cattle into a narrow bottleneck where confusion and panic could easily develop. Alina assessed the situation quickly, then made a decision that demonstrated not just skill but genuine courage. She rode Storm directly into the middle of the confused cattle, using her horse's calm presence to settle the animals while simultaneously guiding them, one by one, through the safest passage around the ROCKSL IDE. It was dangerous work. One spooked animal could have knocked horse and rider into the rocks below. But Alina's confidence and Storm's trust in her rider prevented any such disaster. Within 20 minutes, the entire herd was safely past the obstacle and continuing down toward the ranch buildings. Jake caught up with Alina as they neared the lower pastures. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anyone read cattle in terrain the way you just did up there. That was professional level work." Marcus heard the comment through his open truck window and found himself nodding in reluctant agreement. What he'd witnessed wasn't luck or beginner's fortune. It was the kind of instinctive understanding that separated truly exceptional hands from merely competent ones. As the cattle settled into their home pasture, content and unharmed after their adventure, Alina dismounted and began unsaddling Storm with the same careful attention she'd shown throughout the day. The mare stood quietly, no longer testing her rider but instead showing the kind of relaxed cooperation that indicated genuine partnership. Marcus climbed out of his truck and walked toward the corrals where Alina was finishing her work. For the first time in their acquaintance, he found himself at a loss for words. Everything he'd believed about women's capabilities in ranch work had been challenged by what he'd just witnessed. "Miss Vasquez," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Alina looked up from checking Storm's hooves, her expression expectant, but patient. "Yes, Mr. Blackstone." That was competent work. Jake Sullivan tried to hide a smile. In Marcus Blackstone's vocabulary, competent was highly praised indeed. "Thank you," Alina replied simply. The Storm made it easier. "She's a remarkable horse once she decides to trust you." Marcus studied the mare, noting her calm demeanor and the obvious bond that had developed between horse and rider in just a few hours. Storm had indeed made the work easier, but only because Alina had earned the horse's respect and cooperation through skill and understanding rather than force. "The job pays $4,000 a month, plus room and board," Marcus heard himself saying. 6-day work weeks, long hours during busy seasons, and I expect the same standards from you that I expect from any hand on this ranch. Alina's smile was genuine but unsurprised, as if she'd known all along how this test would end. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. Jake will show you the bunkhouse and explain our daily routines." Marcus paused, then added reluctantly, "Welcome to the Blackstone Ranch, Miss Vasquez." As Alina led Storm toward the barn, Marcus found himself watching her with new eyes. Perhaps 40 years of assumptions had been wrong. Perhaps the best rider in his valley had been standing in front of him all along, waiting for a chance to prove what she could do. The thought was unsettling, but also strangely liberating. If he'd been wrong about Alina, what other assumptions might be worth reconsidering? The bunkhouse that had served as home to generations of cowboys was a study in functional simplicity. Built from native pine logs in the 1940s, it featured 4 sleeping rooms, a common area with a massive stone fireplace, and a kitchen designed for practical efficiency rather than comfort. Jake Sullivan led Elena through the building, pointing out amenities and explaining the informal protocols that governed life on the ranch. "You'll have the corner room," he said, opening a door to reveal a modest space containing a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a small window overlooking the horse paddocks. "Bill and Mike are in the rooms across the hall. They're good men. Been here 3 and 5 years, respectively. They might be a little standoffish at first, but that's just their way with newcomers." Elena set her duffel bag on the bed and looked around the simple accommodations. "This is perfect. Better than most places I've stayed. Breakfast is at 5:30, work starts at 6. We rotate kitchen duty weekly, cooking, cleaning, keeping supplies stocked. The internet's sketchy out here, but there's a landline in the main room for emergencies." Jake paused at the door. "Elena, I want you to know what you did today impressed the hell out of me. But the other hands might take some convincing. They've heard Marcus's opinions about women on ranches for years." That evening, Elena met her new colleagues over a dinner of beef stew and cornbread in the bunkhouse kitchen. Bill Rodriguez was a compact man in his 40s, with graying temples and hands scarred by decades of rope work. Mike Chen appeared younger, maybe early 30s, with the lean build and careful movements of someone who'd grown up around unpredictable horses. Both men were polite but reserved, answering Elena's questions with minimal responses and avoiding direct eye contact. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, exactly, but it carried the tension of men uncertain how to behave around a female colleague in what had always been an exclusively male environment. "So you worked up in Wyoming," Bill said finally, more a statement than a question. "Among other places. Spent 2 seasons in Colorado, 1 in Utah, 3 months in Nevada, helping with a wild horse roundup." Elena kept her tone conversational, not defensive. "Every ranch has its own personality, its own challenges. I'm still learning what makes this place unique." Mike glanced up from his stew. "What kind of challenges did you face in Nevada?" It was the first genuine question either man had asked, and Elena recognized it as a potential opening. The horses were completely feral, hadn't had human contact for generations. Traditional breaking methods didn't work because they were too wild, too panicked. We had to develop entirely new approaches based on patience and psychology rather than force. How'd that work out? Bill's tone carried skepticism but also curiosity. Better than anyone expected. We processed 400 horses over 3 months, and our injury rate for both animals and handlers was lower than any previous roundup in the program's history. It turned out that understanding what motivates a horse works better than just overpowering it. The men exchanged glances, and Elena sensed she'd passed some kind of initial test. The conversation remained cautious, but the outright suspicion began to fade as they discussed various ranching experiences and compared notes on different techniques they'd encountered. Her real integration into the ranch crew began the following morning with a series of routine tasks that tested different aspects of her claimed expertise. Marcus assigned her to work alongside Mike repairing fence lines in the north pasture, tedious but essential work that required physical strength, attention to detail, and the ability to maintain focus over long hours. Elena approached the job methodically, examining the damaged sections and calculating materials needed before beginning repairs. Her technique was efficient but thorough, and she worked steadily without complaint through the morning heat and afternoon wind. "You always this quiet when you work?" Mike asked around midday as they shared lunch beside a partially repaired fence line. "Depends on whether there's something worth talking about," Elena replied, unwrapping a sandwich from her pack. "Some people feel like they need to fill silence. I've always found it easier to think when things are quiet." Mike nodded approvingly. "Bill talks constantly when he's nervous. Drives everyone crazy during brandings." It was a small moment of connection, but Elena recognized its significance. Mike was beginning to see her as a coworker rather than an outsider, judging her by her work ethic rather than her gender, The following days brought a succession of different assignments, each designed to evaluate specific skills essential to ranch operations. Elena worked with Bill vaccinating cattle, demonstrating her knowledge of animal behavior and veterinary procedures. She spent a morning with Jake servicing equipment, showing mechanical aptitude that surprised everyone, including herself. She participated in her first ranch branding, an intense, chaotic operation that tested coordination, timing, and the ability to work as part of a team under pressure. In each case, her performance was solid, not spectacular, but consistently competent and reliable. More importantly, she began developing working relationships with her colleagues, based on mutual respect rather than curiosity or skepticism. The real breakthrough came during her second week on the ranch, when a late-season storm trapped a dozen cattle in a remote canyon where they couldn't reach adequate food or water. The rescue operation required riding into dangerous terrain under deteriorating weather conditions, and Marcus was reluctant to risk his crew on what might be a futile mission. "The forecast shows 3 more days of storms," he explained during an emergency meeting in the ranch office. "By the time we can get up there safely, those cattle might already be lost. But if we go now, we could end up with injured riders and dead horses along with dead cattle." Elena studied the topographical map spread across Marcus's desk, tracing potential routes with her finger. "There's another approach from the eastern ridge. It's longer, but it avoids most of the exposed areas where lightning would be a problem. If we move fast, we could reach them, set up a temporary shelter, and wait out the worst of the storm." "That eastern route hasn't been used in years," Jake objected. "Trail's probably washed out, and even if it isn't, it would take most of a day just to reach the canyon." "Maybe, but those cattle represent $20,000 of ranch assets, and they didn't choose to get trapped up there." Elena looked directly at Marcus. "I'm willing to make the attempt if you are." What followed was the kind of collaborative planning session that characterized the best ranch operations. Elena's route suggestion was evaluated, modified, and improved through input from Jake's knowledge of local terrain and Bill's experience with weather patterns. Mike contributed observations about the specific cattle involved and their likely behavior under stress. The mission that emerged was risky but carefully calculated. Elena and Jake would take the eastern route, carrying supplies for both immediate rescue and potential overnight camping. Bill and Mike would monitor weather conditions and coordinate communications with the nearest Forest Service station in case emergency assistance became necessary. They departed before dawn under a sky heavy with threatening clouds, leading pack horses loaded with feed, emergency medical supplies, and portable shelter equipment. The eastern route proved even more challenging than Elena had anticipated. Sections of trail were indeed washed out, requiring careful detours through terrain that tested both horses and riders, but Elena's navigation proved accurate. They reached the trapped cattle by early afternoon, finding them huddled in the limited shelter provided by overhanging rocks, stressed but still mobile. The rescue operation required improvised solutions to problems no training manual had ever addressed, constructing temporary windbreaks from available materials, creating safe passage through areas where the original trail had been destroyed by erosion, managing frightened animals under increasingly severe weather conditions. Elena's leadership during the crisis revealed qualities that impressed even Jake, who'd initially been skeptical about her inclusion in the dangerous mission. She remained calm under pressure, made decisions quickly but thoughtfully, and adapted her plans when circumstances changed unexpectedly. The storm struck while they were still moving the cattle towards safer ground, bringing driving rain and dangerous winds that made progress extremely difficult. For several hours, the success of their mission was genuinely in doubt as they struggled to maintain control of the frightened animals while navigating treacherous footing in deteriorating visibility. Elena's breakthrough moment came when the lead bull, panicked by thunder and lightning, broke away from the group and headed toward a cliff edge where a fall would mean certain death. Without hesitation, She spurred Storm into a dangerous pursuit across rain-slicked rock, using every ounce of her horsemanship skill to intercept the runaway animal before disaster struck. The successful intervention required split-second timing, absolute trust between horse and rider, and the kind of courage that can't be taught or faked. Elena managed to turn the bull away from the cliff edge and guide him back to the main herd, but the effort left both rider and horse exhausted and shaking from adrenaline. Jake, who'd witnessed the entire sequence, shook his head in amazement. Elena, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish. I'm not sure which. Probably both, Elena replied, dismounting to check Storm for injuries. But we didn't lose the bull, and that's what matters. They completed the rescue operation late that evening, bringing all dozen cattle safely to lower elevation where they could weather the remaining storm in relative comfort. The mission had required 14 hours of dangerous work under increasingly difficult conditions, but it had also demonstrated something important about Elena's character and capabilities. Word of the successful rescue spread quickly through the local ranching community, carried by the informal network of communication that connected isolated operations across hundreds of miles. Elena found herself receiving respectful nods from ranchers she'd never met, acknowledgement that she'd proven herself under conditions that challenged even experienced hands. More significantly, her relationship with her immediate colleagues underwent a fundamental transformation. Bill and Mike began including her in casual conversations, asking her opinion on ranch matters, treating her as a full member of the crew rather than a probationary employee. Even Marcus began consulting her on operational decisions, recognizing that her fresh perspective and proven competence made her input valuable. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and lasting. Elena had moved from being an outsider trying to prove herself to being an accepted member of the ranch community, respected for her skills and valued for her contributions. One evening, as autumn settled deeper into the mountain valleys and the first serious snow appeared on the highest peaks, Elena sat on the bunkhouse porch watching the sunset paint the landscape in brilliant colors. Jake joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the chair beside hers. "You know," he said after several minutes of comfortable silence, "when you first showed up here, I figured Marcus was right about women not belonging on ranches. Nothing personal, just seemed like common sense based on everything I'd seen and experienced." Elena accepted the offered coffee gratefully. "What changed your mind?" "Watching you work. Seeing how you handle problems, how you think through challenges, how you treat the animals and the land." Jake sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Turns out gender doesn't have much to do with whether someone's a good hand or not. It's about character, competence, and commitment. You've got all 3. The conversation marked a milestone in Elena's journey from outsider to insider, but it also represented something larger, the gradual evolution of attitudes and assumptions that had seemed permanent, but proved surprisingly adaptable when confronted with undeniable evidence. As winter approached and the ranch prepared for its most challenging season, Elena had become not just an employee but a valued member of the community that made Blackstone Ranch function. Her presence had changed the dynamic of the operation in subtle but important ways, bringing new perspectives to old problems and demonstrating that excellence in ranching came from dedication and skill rather than conformity to traditional expectations. Winter arrived in Copper Ridge Valley with the brutal efficiency that locals had learned to respect and fear. The first serious snowfall dumped 3 feet of powder in less than 24 hours, transforming the landscape into something both breathtaking and treacherous. For Elena, this marked the beginning of her most challenging test yet, proving that her summer and fall successes could translate into competence during the harsh months when ranching became a matter of survival rather than mere productivity. The morning after the storm, Marcus gathered his crew in the ranch office for the kind of strategic planning session that would determine whether they'd emerge from winter with their livestock, their equipment, and their livelihoods intact. The room was crowded with maps, weather reports, feed calculations, and the accumulated wisdom of decades spent battling Montana's most unforgiving season. Forecast shows this pattern continuing for at least 2 weeks, Marcus announced, pointing to a weather map that looked more like a military battle plan than a simple meteorological report. We've got 600 heads scattered across 4 different winter pastures, and if we can't maintain access to all of them, we're going to lose cattle. Elena studied the logistics board where colored pins marked feed stations, water sources, and shelter areas across thousands of acres of snow-covered terrain. The complexity was staggering. Every pin represented a critical resource that had to be maintained despite conditions that would challenge even experienced winter hands. "What's our biggest vulnerability?" she asked, recognizing that successful winter operations required identifying and addressing weak points before they became disasters. Jake pointed to a cluster of red pins in the northeastern section of the ranch. Willow Creek pasture. It's our most remote location, holds about 120 head, but the access road becomes impassable when we get heavy snow. Last winter we lost 8 cattle up there because we couldn't reach them for 5 days. During a blizzard, what about alternative access? Snowmobile routes, anything that doesn't depend on vehicle traffic? There's an old logging trail that connects to Forest Service Road 47, Bill offered. But it hasn't been maintained in years, and even with snowmobiles, it's a difficult route. It takes most of the day to reach the pasture, and if the weather closes in while you're up there. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications of being caught in remote territory during a Montana blizzard. Marcus looked directly at Elena. "You've worked winter operations before. What's your assessment?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Marcus was asking for her professional judgment on a life-or-death decision that would affect both livestock and human safety. It was the kind of responsibility that marked the difference between being an employee and being a trusted partner in ranch management. Elena approached the problem methodically, studying maps and calculating distances, feed requirements, and weather windows. After several minutes of careful analysis, she presented her conclusions with the confidence of someone who'd faced similar challenges before. "We establish a forward supply cache at the halfway point on the logging trail. Pre-position enough feed and emergency supplies to support operations for a week without resupply. Then we maintain a regular rotation schedule. Someone checks the herd every other day during stable weather, daily during storm periods. That means exposing our people to significant risk on a regular basis," Marcus observed. "Less risk than trying to manage crisis rescues when cattle are already dying," Elena replied. "Controlled, planned exposure during manageable conditions beats emergency operations during disasters." What emerged from the planning session was Elena's first opportunity to design and lead a major ranch operation from conception to execution. Marcus assigned her responsibility for establishing and maintaining the Willow Creek supply line, with authority to requisition equipment, coordinate schedules, and make tactical decisions based on changing conditions. The assignment was both an honor and a challenge. Success would cement her position as a fully trusted member of the ranch leadership. Failure could mean dead cattle, injured personnel, and the end of her credibility with both Marcus and her colleagues. Elena's first innovation was recruiting Storm as her primary partner for the winter operations. The Mare's intelligence and sure-footedness made her ideal for navigating treacherous terrain, while their established partnership meant they could work together with minimal communication, even in conditions where visibility and hearing were compromised. The supply cache establishment required 3 days of grueling work in temperatures that never rose above 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Elena, Mike, and a temporary helper from town used snowmobiles to transport materials along the partially cleared logging trail, then constructed a weatherproof shelter capable of protecting feed, medical supplies, and emergency equipment from both wildlife and weather. But the real test came during the first blizzard of the season, when sustained winds and driving snow created whiteout conditions that made travel dangerous even for experienced winter riders. Elena's monitoring schedule called for checking the Willow Creek herd during the storm's second day, but conditions were so severe that even Jake questioned the wisdom of attempting the journey. "Elena, I've lived in this country for 40 years. And I'm telling you this weather is too dangerous for anyone to be out there alone," he argued during an emergency consultation in the ranch office. "If something goes wrong, we might not be able to reach you for days." Elena appreciated his concern, but she also recognized what was at stake. "Jake, if we don't check those cattle today, we won't know their condition until after the storm passes. By then, if there's a problem with water or shelter, we could lose significant numbers. So we wait for better weather and hope for the best. It's not ideal, but it's safer than risking human lives." Elena studied the weather reports and calculated odds with the cold precision of someone who'd learned that emotions were a luxury that winter ranching couldn't afford. "I can reach the cache safely, and from there assess conditions before deciding whether to continue to the herd. If visibility is too poor or conditions too dangerous, I'll turn back. But if there's a reasonable chance of success, those cattle deserve the attempt." Marcus listened to the debate with the expression of a man weighing risks that had no perfect solutions. Finally, he made the kind of decision that separated successful ranch owners from those who merely survived. Elena's call. She's got the most experience with winter operations, and it's her system we're testing. But you don't go alone. Mike goes with you, and you maintain radio contact every 30 minutes. The journey to Willow Creek during the blizzard became the defining experience of Elena's first winter on the Blackstone Ranch. Conditions were indeed severe. Visibility rarely exceeded 20 feet. Wind gusts threatened to knock riders from their horses, and temperatures with wind chill dropped below -30 degrees. But Elena's preparation and Storm's reliability proved equal to the challenge. They navigated the treacherous trail using compass bearings and landmark recognition, reached the supply cache without incident, and continued to the remote pasture where they found the cattle huddled, but healthy in the shelter areas Elena had helped establish earlier in the season. The discovery that made the dangerous journey worthwhile came when they found that a section of fence had been damaged by falling timber, creating a gap that would have allowed the cattle to wander into unsheltered areas where they could have frozen. Elena and Mike spent 4 hours in brutal conditions repairing the damage, work that almost certainly saved multiple lives among the herd. More importantly, Elena's systematic approach to the problem, advanced planning, calculated risk-taking, and thorough execution, demonstrated a level of professional competence that impressed even Marcus's exacting standards. The return journey tested their endurance and navigation skills, as darkness fell and the storm continued with undiminished intensity. But Elena's route selection and Storm's sure-footedness brought them safely home, where their report of successful herd welfare and fence repairs validated the entire winter monitoring system. Word of Elena's blizzard ride spread through the local ranching community with the speed that dramatic stories achieve in isolated areas, where excitement is rare and courage is highly valued. The fact that she'd successfully completed a mission that even experienced cowboys might have considered too dangerous enhanced her growing reputation as someone who could be counted on when conditions were at their worst. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from the subtle changes in how her colleagues treated her after the storm. The polite professionalism that had characterized their relationships evolved into the casual familiarity reserved for trusted partners. She was included in informal decision-making discussions, consulted on matters beyond her direct responsibilities, and treated as someone whose judgment carried weight in ranch operations. The transformation was most evident in Marcus's behavior toward her. The man who'd initially refused to consider hiring a woman began seeking her input on strategic decisions affecting the entire ranch operation. Her success with the Willow Creek monitoring system led to similar assignments for other remote areas, expanding her responsibilities and influence within the ranch hierarchy. By midwinter, Elena had become Marcus's unofficial second-in-command for operations planning, working directly with him to coordinate feed schedules, equipment maintenance, and personnel assignments. The promotion was never formally announced, but everyone on the ranch understood that Elena's opinions carried almost as much weight as Jake's in matters of ranch policy. The culmination of her winter success came during a crisis that tested every aspect of her accumulated skills and experience. A Chinook wind event, one of those freakish weather patterns unique to the Mountain West, brought 70-degree temperatures and torrential rain to an area covered by 4 feet of snow. The result was catastrophic flooding, as the sudden snowmelt overwhelmed creek beds and drainage systems that hadn't been designed to handle such massive water volume. The flood threatened not only cattle in low-lying areas but also critical ranch infrastructure, including bridges, feed storage facilities, and sections of the main access road. Elena found herself coordinating a complex emergency response that required split-second decision-making, precise resource allocation, and the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught from textbooks. Her performance during the crisis was masterful. She organized cattle evacuations from threatened areas, coordinated equipment deployment to protect essential facilities, and managed personnel assignments that kept everyone working efficiently despite the chaos and stress. Most impressively, she maintained calm, clear communication throughout the emergency, ensuring that everyone understood their responsibilities and felt confident in the overall response plan. When the crisis passed and damage assessments were completed, the ranch had suffered minimal livestock losses despite facing the worst natural disaster in the area's recorded history. Elena's emergency management had not only protected the ranch's immediate interests, but had also earned recognition from neighboring operations who'd observed her response to the flooding. Marcus's evaluation of Elena's performance was characteristically understated, but genuinely appreciative. "Miss Vasquez, your work this winter has exceeded my expectations in every measurable way. You've proven yourself capable of handling responsibility at the highest levels of ranch management." Elena accepted the praise with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd set out to prove a point and succeeded beyond her own expectations. "Thank you, sir. This ranch gave me the opportunity to show what I could do, and I'm grateful for that chance. The question now," Marcus continued, "is whether you're interested in taking on even greater responsibilities. I'm not getting any younger, and operations of this complexity require more management attention than one person can provide effectively." The offer implicit in his words represented a level of professional recognition that Elena had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect so quickly. Partnership in ranch management meant not just employment, but genuine influence over decisions affecting thousands of acres and hundreds of animals. As spring approached, and the immediate challenges of winter began to ease, Elena found herself contemplating a future that had seemed impossible just months earlier. She'd not only proven that women could succeed in ranch work, she demonstrated that the right person could excel regardless of traditional expectations about gender roles in agriculture. Spring arrived in Copper Ridge Valley with the explosive energy that follows a harsh winter, transforming frozen streams into rushing torrents and painting the mountainsides with the fresh green of new grass. For Elena, the changing season brought both opportunity and challenge, as she prepared to face the ultimate test of her growing influence on the Blackstone Ranch, the annual cattle drive that would move the entire herd to summer grazing grounds. In the high country. The drive was more than just a logistical operation. It was a tradition that connected the ranch to its historical roots and a proving ground, where reputations were made or destroyed. Every rancher in the valley would be watching, judging not just Elena's performance but Marcus's decision to trust a woman with such significant responsibilities. Marcus called a planning meeting in early April, spreading detailed topographical Maps across the oak table in his office while Elena, Jake, Bill, and Mike gathered around to discuss the complexities ahead. The route they would follow had been used for generations, but each year brought new challenges, weather conditions, terrain changes, herd composition, and the ever-present variables that could turn a routine drive into a dangerous emergency. "We're moving 800 head this year," Marcus began, his finger tracing the traditional path through mountain passes and across rivers swollen with snowmelt. "The route takes us through Devil's Canyon, across Willow Creek at the Narrows, and up through Sunset Pass to the High Meadows. Under normal conditions, it's a 4-day journey with established camping spots and reliable water sources." Elena studied the route carefully, noting potential bottlenecks and hazard areas. "What makes this year different from previous drives?" Jake pointed to several areas marked in red on the map. "That Chinook flooding damaged 3 of our traditional river crossings. We'll have to find alternatives, and some of the backup routes haven't been used in years. Plus, we've got about 100 head of young cattle who've never made this drive before. First-year animals can be unpredictable in unfamiliar territory." The logistical challenges were staggering. 800 cattle represented not just significant economic value, but also 800 individual animals with their own behaviors, instincts, and potential for causing problems. Managing such a large herd through dangerous terrain required perfect coordination between riders, horses, and the cattle themselves. Elena's first major decision as co-leader of the drive was controversial but strategically sound. Instead of following the traditional approach of moving the entire herd as one massive group, she proposed dividing the cattle into 3 smaller groups that would travel the route in sequence, separated by several hours. "Smaller groups are easier to control, especially when we're dealing with inexperienced cattle," she explained to a skeptical audience. "If we have a stampede or other emergency with one group, it doesn't automatically affect all 800 heads. Plus, we can use the lead group to test conditions and route modifications for the groups following behind." Marcus considered the proposal carefully. That approach requires more riders and extends the overall timeline. We'd need additional personnel, more coordination, and backup plans for each group. True, but it also reduces the risk of catastrophic losses. A problem with 200 cattle is manageable. A problem with 800 cattle could bankrupt the ranch. The debate that followed revealed the depth of Elena's strategic thinking and her growing confidence in challenging conventional wisdom when she believed a better approach existed. She presented detailed analyses of historical drive records, weather patterns, and cattle behavior studies that supported her divided herd strategy. More importantly, she'd already begun recruiting the additional personnel needed to implement her plan. Jim McLeod had agreed to return from Wyoming with 2 experienced hands, drawn by curiosity about Elena's innovative approach and loyalty to someone he considered one of the finest cowboys he'd ever trained. Several local ranchers had offered to loan experienced riders in exchange for similar assistance during their own seasonal operations. Marcus's decision to adopt Elena's strategy represented a watershed moment in their professional relationship. By endorsing her approach over traditional methods, he was publicly acknowledging her expertise and judgment in matters affecting the ranch's most critical operation. "We'll do it your way, Elena, but understand, if this fails, it's not just cattle we lose. It's the reputation this ranch has built over 40 years. Elena accepted the responsibility with the calm confidence that had become her trademark. "I understand the stakes, Mr. Blackstone. I wouldn't have proposed this approach if I wasn't confident it would work." The weeks leading up to the drive were a masterclass in preparation and attention to detail. Elena personally inspected every section of the proposed route, identifying alternative paths around damaged river crossings and establishing supply caches at strategic points. She worked with each rider to ensure they understood not just their individual responsibilities, but how their role fitted into the larger operation. Most importantly, She spent hours studying the cattle themselves, learning their individual characteristics and group dynamics. She identified natural leaders within the herd whose behavior could influence hundreds of other animals, potential troublemakers whose separation might prevent larger problems, and nervous animals who might panic under stress and trigger stampedes. The drive began before dawn on a crisp morning in late May, with Elena leading the first group of 250 head out of the ranch's main gates. The early morning departure was strategic. Cooler temperatures kept the cattle calmer, and starting early allowed maximum daylight for navigating the most challenging terrain. Elena's mount for the drive was Storm, whose intelligence and responsiveness had proven invaluable during the winter operations. The Mari seemed to understand the significance of the occasion, moving with alert confidence and responding to Elena's slightest signals as they guided the lead cattle onto the mountain trail that would take them to summer pasture. The first days' progress exceeded even Elena's optimistic projections. The smaller herd size made navigation through narrow canyon passages significantly easier, and the cattle responded well to the calm, patient handling that Elena had insisted all riders employ. By evening, they'd covered more ground than typical. First-day drives while maintaining better control over the herd. But the real test came on the second day, when they reached the first of the damaged river crossings that had necessitated route modifications. The traditional ford had been scoured away by spring flooding, leaving a crossing point that was both deeper and more turbulent than the cattle were accustomed to. Elena's solution demonstrated the kind of innovative problem-solving that was becoming her signature approach to ranch challenges. Instead of forcing the nervous cattle directly into the unfamiliar water, she positioned experienced riders upstream and downstream to create visual barriers that made the crossing appear safer. She also used the herd's natural following instinct by leading a small group of calm, older cattle across first, encouraging the others to follow their example. The strategy worked perfectly. The entire first group crossed safely, and their success provided valuable intelligence for the two groups following behind. Elena's radio reports to Jake, who was leading the second group, allowed them to implement the same crossing technique with equal success. The drive's most dangerous moment came on the third day, when an unexpected thunderstorm struck while they were navigating a particularly exposed section of the route through Sunset Pass. Lightning and thunder in open country could easily trigger a cattle stampede, and 800 panicked animals in mountainous terrain could result in catastrophic losses. Elena's response to the crisis showcased every skill she'd developed during her months on the ranch. She immediately spread her riders to strategic positions that would help control the herd if panic developed, while simultaneously moving the cattle toward natural shelter areas she'd identified during her route reconnaissance. Most importantly, she maintained calm, clear communication with all three groups via radio, coordinating their movements to prevent the kind of confusion that could turn a manageable situation into a disaster. Her steady voice and confident instructions helped keep both cattle and riders calm during the most stressful moments of the entire drive. When the storm passed, and they could assess the situation, Elena's crisis management had prevented any significant problems. All three groups remained under control, no cattle had been lost, and no riders had been injured despite facing conditions that could easily have resulted in tragedy. The successful completion of the drive on the fourth day marked a triumph not just for Elena personally, but for her innovative approach to traditional ranching challenges. 800 head of cattle had been moved safely to summer pasture using methods that reduced risk, improved efficiency, and demonstrated that questioning conventional wisdom could lead to better outcomes. The local ranching community's response to Elena's success was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Ranchers who'd been skeptical about both her capabilities and Marcus's decision to trust her with such responsibility were forced to acknowledge that her methods had produced superior results to traditional approaches. More significantly, several neighboring operations began requesting Elena's consultation on their own challenging logistics problems. Word spread through the informal networks that connected isolated ranches across hundreds of miles, carrying stories of the woman who'd revolutionized cattle drive techniques while maintaining perfect safety records. Marcus's evaluation of Elena's performance was characteristically understated, but unmistakably proud. "Elena, what you accomplished this week represents some of the finest ranch management I've seen in 4 decades of this work. Your methods didn't just get the job done, they improved on approaches that have been used successfully for generations." Elena accepted the praise with genuine gratitude, recognizing how far she'd traveled from the skeptical reception she'd received less than a year earlier. "Thank you, Marcus. This ranch gave me the opportunity to prove what innovative thinking could accomplish when combined with respect for traditional values and deep understanding of the work itself." But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from the subtle changes in how the broader ranching community treated her. The polite skepticism that had greeted her arrival in Copper Ridge Valley had evolved into genuine respect, and several established ranchers had begun seeking her advice on operational challenges affecting their own spreads. The transformation was most evident during the community gathering that followed the successful completion of spring drives throughout the valley. Elena found herself included in conversations about regional ranching policy, consulted on matters affecting the entire agricultural community, and treated as a peer by men who'd initially dismissed her as an outsider with unrealistic ambitions. One evening, as the celebration wound down and neighbors began departing for their own ranches, Elena stood on Marcus's front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. Marcus joined her, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey and settling into the chair he'd occupied during their first contentious meeting. "You know," he said after several minutes of comfortable silence, "when you first showed up here, I thought I was being generous by even listening to your arguments about women in ranch work." Elena accepted the offered whiskey gratefully. "I remember. You were pretty clear about your position. I was wrong. Not just about you specifically, but about the whole question of what determines success in this work." Marcus sipped his drink thoughtfully. "You've taught me that excellence comes from understanding, innovation, and dedication, not from conforming to traditional expectations about who belongs in a saddle." Elena smiled, remembering her own uncertainties during those first difficult weeks when acceptance had seemed impossible. "Marcus, you gave me something more valuable than a job. You gave me the chance to prove that assumptions can be overcome by performance, and that the best person for any job might not be the person everyone expects." As stars emerged in the darkening sky above Copper Ridge Valley, Elena reflected on her transformation from unwelcome outsider to respected leader in one of ranching's most traditional communities. She'd not only succeeded in proving her individual capabilities, she'd demonstrated that questioning established practices could lead to better outcomes for everyone involved. The conversation marked a milestone in Elena's journey. But it also represented something larger, the gradual evolution of an entire community's understanding of what was possible when talent and dedication were valued more highly than conformity to historical patterns. 2 years after Elena Vasquez first arrived at the Blackstone Ranch, the landscape of ranching in Copper Ridge Valley had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. What began as one woman's fight for acceptance had evolved into a transformation of how an entire community thought about capability, leadership, and the future of their industry. The change was most visible during the monthly meetings of the Copper Ridge Cattlemen's Association, where Elena now sat not as a curious observer, but as the newly elected vice president of an organization that had never before included a woman in its leadership structure. Her election hadn't been a token gesture or political statement. It was the recognition of expertise that had proven itself through 2 seasons of innovative solutions and exceptional results. The meeting in late autumn focused on a crisis that threatened every ranch in the valley. A severe drought had reduced water levels in the primary river system to dangerous lows, while simultaneously driving up feed costs to unsustainable levels. Traditional approaches to managing such challenges had proven inadequate, and several smaller operations were facing the possibility of having to sell their herds at devastating losses. Elena listened carefully to the reports from various ranchers, noting the patterns of struggle and the recurring themes of desperation. When called upon to address the group, she approached the podium with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "Gentlemen, the problems we're facing are temporary setbacks that will resolve themselves with good weather and patience. They're fundamental changes in our operating environment that require us to think differently about how we manage our operations." She activated a slide projector that displayed detailed maps of the valley's watershed, marked with data she'd been collecting for months. Water rights, grazing rotation schedules, and feed production systems that worked for our fathers aren't adequate for the challenges we face today. But instead of viewing this as a crisis, I suggest we treat it as an opportunity to build a more sustainable and profitable future. What Elena proposed was revolutionary by the standards of traditional ranching communities. Instead of competing with each other for increasingly scarce resources, she suggested forming cooperative management districts that would allow shared use of water sources, coordinated grazing schedules that maximized land productivity, and joint purchasing agreements that could reduce feed costs. Through bulk buying power, the proposal was met initially with skepticism, then growing interest as Elena detailed the economic advantages her research had identified. Ranchers who'd been struggling individually could prosper collectively, but only if they were willing to abandon the fierce independence that had historically characterized their industry. "Miss Vasquez," interrupted Harrison Webb, whose family had operated the largest spread in the valley for 3 generations, "what you're suggesting would fundamentally change how we've done business for over a century. These operations were built on individual initiative and personal responsibility, not collective decision-making." Elena nodded respectfully. "Mr. Webb, I absolutely agree that individual initiative and personal responsibility are essential values that have made this industry successful. But I'm not suggesting we abandon those principles. I'm suggesting we apply them to challenges that are bigger than any single operation can handle alone." She advanced to her next slide, which displayed financial projections based on different levels of cooperation between valley ranchers. The numbers show that coordinated resource management could reduce operating costs by an average of 35%, while increasing productivity by nearly 20%. Those aren't minor improvements, they represent the difference between struggling to survive and building profitable, sustainable operations. Marcus Blackstone, who'd remained silent during most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "Elena, your analysis is impressive, but what happens when individual ranchers disagree about priorities or management decisions? How do you maintain cooperation when personal interests conflict?" It was exactly the question Elena had been prepared to address, because it went to the heart of human nature and business relationships. "Marcus, conflicts are inevitable in any collaborative enterprise. The key is establishing clear governance structures, transparent decision-making processes, and dispute resolution mechanisms that protect individual interests while maintaining collective benefits." She outlined a framework for cooperative management that balanced democratic input with expert leadership, ensuring that decisions would be based on sound data and professional judgment rather than politics or personal grudges. Most importantly, her proposal included escape mechanisms that allowed individual ranchers to withdraw from cooperative arrangements if they proved unsatisfactory. The debate that followed revealed both the promise and the challenges of Elena's vision. Younger ranchers, facing the greatest economic pressures, were generally supportive of innovative approaches that could improve their financial situations. Older, more established operators worried about losing control over operations they'd built through decades of individual effort, but Elena's credibility, earned through 2 years of exceptional performance and proven results, gave weight to her arguments that no newcomer to the community could have achieved. When she spoke about water management, Ranchers listened because they'd seen her handle winter emergencies with skill and innovation. When she discussed cattle handling techniques, her audience knew she'd successfully managed the most challenging drives in the valley's recent history. The meeting ended with agreement to form a study committee that would spend the winter months developing detailed proposals for cooperative resource management. Elena was unanimously selected to chair the committee, a responsibility that effectively positioned her as the architect of the valley's agricultural future. As ranchers filed out into the crisp autumn evening, Harrison Webb approached Elena with an expression that mixed respect with curiosity. "Miss Vasquez, when you first arrived in this valley, I'll admit I thought Marcus Blackstone had lost his mind hiring a woman for serious ranch work. Now I find myself wondering if you might be the smartest person in this room." Elena smiled at the backhanded compliment. "Mr. Webb, I think this room is full of smart people who've built successful operations under challenging conditions. The difference might be that I'm not invested in maintaining traditional approaches just because they've worked in the past." "Fair enough. But I have to ask, what's your long-term vision for this valley? Where do you see us in 5 or 10 years? It was a question Elena had been contemplating since her first successful cattle drive, when she'd realized that her individual success could be leveraged to benefit the entire ranching community. "I see a network of operations that are more profitable, more sustainable, and more resilient than anything we could achieve working in isolation. But I also see a community that's preserved the values and traditions that make ranching culture worth maintaining." The conversation represented a broader transformation that was occurring throughout the valley as Elena's influence expanded beyond the boundaries of the Blackstone Ranch. Ranchers who'd initially viewed her as an anomaly now sought her consultation on their most challenging problems. Her innovative approaches to traditional challenges had generated solutions that benefited everyone, regardless of their initial attitudes toward women in agriculture. The winter months that followed were among the most productive in Elena's life. As chairwoman of the Resource Management Committee, she worked with representatives from 12 different ranching operations to develop comprehensive plans for cooperative water use, coordinated grazing schedules, and joint marketing agreements. Work was complex and often frustrating, requiring her to balance competing interests while maintaining focus on shared objectives. But Elena's ability to find common ground between conflicting perspectives proved as valuable in committee meetings as it had been in managing difficult cattle through dangerous terrain. Her greatest achievement was designing a governance structure that preserved individual ranch autonomy while enabling collective action on issues requiring coordinated responses. The system she developed allowed ranchers to participate in cooperative programs that benefited their operations while retaining complete control over day-to-day management decisions. By spring, the Copper Ridge Valley Cooperative Management District had become a reality, with Elena serving as its first executive director. The position was part-time, allowing her to maintain her responsibilities at the Blackstone Ranch while providing leadership for an organization that represented over 50,000 acres and 1,500 head of cattle. The cooperative's first major test came during another severe drought that struck during Elena's third year in the valley. But this time, instead of struggling individually against impossible conditions, member ranches implemented coordinated responses that maximized water efficiency and minimized economic losses. Shared grazing rotations ensured that no single pasture was overstressed by desperate cattle seeking scarce grass. Joint water management allowed strategic distribution of limited resources, based on herd needs rather than arbitrary property boundaries. Bulk purchasing of supplemental feed reduced costs while ensuring adequate nutrition for all livestock. The results were dramatic and undeniable. While ranches outside the cooperative struggled with significant cattle losses and financial hardship, member operations maintained herd health and actually improved their profit margins, despite challenging conditions. Elena's success with the cooperative attracted attention beyond Copper Ridge Valley. Agricultural extension agents, university researchers, and ranchers from across the Mountain West began visiting to study the management innovations she'd developed. Several other regions began implementing similar cooperative structures, adapting Elena's models to their local conditions and challenges. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source: the American Cattlemen's Association, an organization with over 175,000 members nationwide, invited Elena to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention in Denver. The invitation represented acknowledgement from the highest levels of the industry that her contributions had implications far beyond a single valley in Montana. Elena's speech to the convention focused on themes that had guided her journey from unemployed drifter to respected industry leader. She spoke about the importance of questioning assumptions, the value of innovation rooted in solid understanding of traditional practices, and the potential for collaborative approaches to strengthen, rather than threaten individual success. The future of ranching doesn't require us to abandon the values that built this industry, she told an audience of several thousand cattlemen. But it does require us to apply those values to new challenges with open minds and innovative thinking. The question isn't whether women belong in ranch work, or whether cooperation can coexist with individual initiative. The question is whether we're willing to embrace the best solutions, regardless of where they come from, or how different they are from what we've done before. The speech received a standing ovation from an audience that had historically been skeptical of both female leadership and cooperative management approaches. But more importantly, it generated dozens of invitations for Elena to consult with ranching operations facing similar challenges across the country. As Elena's reputation expanded nationally, Marcus Blackstone faced a decision that would have seemed impossible during their first contentious meeting. Elena's expertise had become so valuable that other organizations were offering her opportunities that could provide financial compensation and professional recognition far exceeding what his ranch could match. The conversation they had about her future took place in the same office where they'd first debated whether women belonged in ranch work. But now the dynamic was completely different. Marcus was trying to convince Elena to stay rather than explaining why she should leave. Elena, I know I can't match the salary offers you're receiving from consulting firms and agricultural corporations, but I can offer you something that might be more valuable in the long term: the opportunity to build something lasting right here in this valley. Elena considered his words carefully. The external opportunities were indeed attractive, offering financial security and professional advancement that would have seemed like impossible dreams during her difficult early years. But they also represented a return to the rootless existence she'd known before, finding her place in the Copper Ridge community. Marcus, when I first arrived here, I was looking for a job. What I found was something much more valuable: the chance to be part of a community and contribute to something bigger than my individual success. That's not something I'm eager to leave behind. Marcus smiled with relief and genuine affection. In that case, I have a proposition that might interest you. I'm getting older, and managing an operation in this complex is becoming more challenging every year. How would you feel about becoming a full partner in the Blackstone Ranch, with authority to implement whatever innovations you think would benefit our operation? The offer represented complete validation of Elena's journey from unwelcome outsider to indispensable partner. But more than that, it represented an opportunity to continue building the kind of sustainable, profitable, and community-minded operation that could serve as a model for the future of ranching. Elena accepted Marcus's partnership offer with gratitude and excitement, recognizing that her individual success had created opportunities for broader impact that extended far beyond her original goals. The woman who'd once been told that she didn't belong in ranch work had become a leader whose innovations were transforming how an entire industry approached its most fundamental challenges. As autumn returned to Copper Ridge Valley, Elena stood once again on the ranch house porch where her journey had begun. But now, instead of facing an uncertain future as an unwelcome outsider, she was contemplating the possibilities that lay ahead as a respected leader whose vision was reshaping her chosen profession. Storm grazed peacefully in the nearby pasture. No longer the difficult horse that tested every rider, but a trusted partner whose intelligence and loyalty had contributed to Elena's success. The Mare's transformation paralleled Elena's own journey from suspicious outsider to valued community member, proof that respect and cooperation could overcome even the deepest initial skepticism. The story that began with rejection and doubt had evolved into one of acceptance, innovation, and leadership that extended far beyond its humble origins. Elena Vasquez had not only proven that women belonged in ranch work, she had demonstrated that questioning traditional assumptions could lead to better outcomes for everyone involved. In the end, the rancher who had once declared, "I don't hire women," had discovered that the best person for any job might be someone who challenged his expectations, expanded his understanding, and ultimately helped him build something better than he could have achieved alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.